This is the FT1211 Dogleg assembly machine. It is designed to assemble and disassemble every standard Aeroquip industrial and marine screw-together fitting. It will accommodate straight and elbow fittings, including dogleg fittings ranging from -3 3/16 of an inch to -48 3 inch. Before we begin, for safety, never permit anyone to operate this equipment unless they have read and thoroughly understand the operator's manual. Before each cycle, remove all tooling and wrenches from the work area. Let's review the basic components of the FT1211. Looking at the top of the machine, we have the spindle vise with a 9 3/4 inch through hole. Over this is the Lexan guard, which has to be moved forward to protect the operator from moving parts during assembly. Next is the carriage vise with a carriage travel, a rack and pinion drive. All of these components of the dogleg assembly machine are anchored to this heavy-duty steel frame. Built into this frame is a tool cabinet, and a 115-volt work light is mounted on the top of the frame. The 115-volt control panel is on your left, including the on-off, manual and auto, reverse and forward, stop and auto position push buttons. Next to the control panel, we have the micro limit switch with the clamp for automatic positioning. Here, under the limit switch, is the main control panel with the on-off breaker. Mounted on the lower steel frame is a 2 horsepower motor that is wired for 460 volt, 3-phase, 60 Hz electrical connections. The machine's polarity is correct. When in the forward mode, the spindle rotates counterclockwise. Next, we have the 2-speed gear-driven transmission, which drives the chain for the spindle vise. The FT1211 is supplied with a complete set of tooling that includes 2 flat inserts, 3 large inserts full length, 1 large insert with cutaway, 2 small inserts full length, and 2 small inserts with cutaway. This tooling is used in the carriage vise and spindle vise. Also included is an Allen wrench and T-handle wrench used for tooling installation. The FT1211-2-3 faceplate is designed for assembling and disassembling straight captive flanged fittings. The pot chuck is used to assemble and disassemble a variety of straight and elbow fittings. It affords the strongest method of gripping fitting hex surfaces in comparison to other attachments or machine vices. Let's assemble a -16 dogleg hose assembly with a 90-degree end fitting with a flange, a 90-degree dogleg elbow, and a straight flange fitting. To determine recommended tooling, please reference the tooling guide located in the FT1211 LM-2-4 instruction manual. Next to each part are codes indicating the various possible methods of assembly and disassembly using different attachments. For our first fitting, we will install small inserts in the spindle vise and large inserts into the carriage vise. Next, clamp the -16 socket into the spindle vise using the supplied T-wrench. Then clamp the hose into the carriage vise. Move the Lexan guard into position and turn the power button on. Press the forward button and advance the carriage toward the spindle vise to seat the socket onto the hose. Once fully seated, back the hose out of the socket a quarter turn by pressing the reverse button. Turn off the power button, remove and rotate the hose 180 degrees to repeat the socket installation process for the opposite end. Upon completion, remove the hose and install flat insert tooling as recommended in the tooling guide for installation of the 90-degree dogleg fitting. Clamp the socket fitting into the carriage vise using the large inserts. Apply a small amount of lubricant to the threads on the inside of the socket fitting and also onto the threads of the 90-degree dogleg fitting. Pre-start the 90-degree fitting into the socket fitting, then advance the carriage vise to allow the 90-degree fitting to be clamped into the spindle vise. Slide the Lexan guard into position. Pull the power button on. Check for manual mode and then press the forward button while advancing the carriage vise. If the fitting requires a specific angle, the FT1211 allows you to preset the position in which the spindle vise will automatically stop while using the auto position button. Please reference the operator manual setup instructions. Upon completion, loosen the spindle vise and carriage vise to remove the assembly. Remove the flat tooling inserts from the spindle vise and then install the large tooling inserts from the carriage vise into the spindle vise. Now install the flat tooling inserts into the carriage vise. Lubricate the socket and pre-start the 90-degree end fitting with flange into the socket. Clamp the socket fitting into the spindle vise and then clamp the 90-degree end fitting into the flat inserts on the carriage vise. Move the Lexan guard into place, turn the power button on. Then press the forward button while advancing the carriage vise toward the spindle vise to seat the fitting onto the hose. Once fully seated, remove the assembly from the spindle vise and carriage vise. Next, lubricate and pre-assemble the socket fitting for the next section of the assembly, and then clamp the socket fitting into the spindle vise and clamp the 90-degree elbow into the tooling on the carriage vise. Move the Lexan guard into position and turn on the power and press the forward button while moving the carriage vise toward the spindle vise. Once fully seated, turn the power off and remove the hose assembly and the large tooling inserts in the spindle vise and flat tooling inserts in the carriage vise. Now we are going to assemble our last fitting, a straight captive flange fitting. There are two options for assembling a straight captive flange fitting. The first option is the FT1211-2-3 faceplate, designed to assemble straight medium pressure captive flange fittings. The FT1211-2-3 faceplate has 4 movable tapped bolt holes and several back bolt holes in fixed positions to accommodate a variety of flanged fittings. Ring grooves on the faceplate aid in centering the fittings for assembly. Fittings should be installed onto the faceplate prior to installing the faceplate into the spindle vise. The second option for installing captive flange fittings is the FT1211-2-1 pot chuck. When installing the pot chuck, place the wood cradle block onto the bed of the machine between the carriage rails to support the pot chuck during installation. Place the pot chuck onto the cradle and then tighten the spindle vise to secure the pot chuck. Remove the cradle block. Install the large inserts into the carriage vise and then clamp the socket fitting into the carriage vise. Next, loosen the swing bolt on the pot chuck and open the pot chuck to install the straight flange fitting and then retighten the swing bolt using the T-handle wrench. Lubricate the threads on the straight flange fitting and the threads on the socket fitting. Move the carriage vise forward, slide the Lexan guard into position. Switch the transmission to low. Turn the power on and press the forward button while advancing the carriage vise toward the spindle vise and pot chuck. Once the fitting is seated, turn the power off and loosen the carriage vise and swing bolt to remove the completed dogleg hose assembly. This completes the overview of the FT1211 dogleg machine.